Hi again, everybody. David here for ChessDojo, and today we're going to do a second set of exercises, simple little exercises to check whether or not you have understood and just to develop further your understanding of the ideas that I gave in the what to do video. So in a sense, this is the fourth and final video in this little series. If you haven't watched the earlier videos, you're not really going to be able to follow this one without doing that, so you have to go back. So now that you have paused this video and gone and watched the other videos and come back and all that, let me tell you what we're going to do here. We're going to look at 5 positions. In each position, you're going to want to pause the video and think about the position yourself and try and come up with some ideas for what white or black could do in that position. I'll tell you whose move it is. Then you'll unpause the video and I'll give a few ideas for what white or black could have done in that position, and you can compare that with what you were thinking about. All right, and to help you a little bit, I have over here the list of general ideas or topics or things that you can do in a chess game when you don't know exactly what you should or shouldn't be doing. So we have that handy guide beside us. We've got our first position here. This one is black to play. Go ahead and pause your video for the first time. This is really only of value if you stop at each point and gather your own thoughts and then add and compare them. So, all right, I'm gonna assume that you've paused the video and already come back to me, and I'm gonna get into this from black's perspective, things black could do. Improve a piece is on the list. Yes, these rooks could be improved. How could they be improved? Well, the rook on f8 could go to e8. That would be a very simple one move thing to do. A lot of times the things to do are going to be very, very simple, short operations. As short as one move, maybe often 2 moves, but they're not necessarily going to be, or they're rarely going to be 20-step plans. So if you looked at this position, you just didn't know what to do, and you said, oh, this rook would be better on e8 than on f8, that would be enough. There you go, right there, you've got a good idea. So if that was one of your ideas, good for you. Oh, I forgot to say in the intro, ideally you're coming up with multiple ideas. I may have said it, but not stressed it properly. This is not about finding the best plan or the best idea. This is just about coming up with some idea. And to be better at coming up with some idea, I encourage you to try and find more than one idea in the examples that we're going to go through today. And you don't have to have all the same examples as me. There's not a really hard and fast scoring on this. You don't have to have the best idea versus the third best idea. Just something that makes the list is kind of what we're looking for. And I'll say some things that are good or bad about different ideas. So if black were to improve a piece, the queen could also figure on this list. Could be 3 pieces to try to improve. I could imagine a lot of people playing the move queen c7 here to back up the bishop and try to create a weakness on the king side. Or maybe in some of your minds, win a pawn very sneakily because white won't see it coming. But since queen e7 is a direct one-move threat, we're actually going to give our opponent the benefit of the assumption that they possess a brain and that there's a very good chance they'll stop it. So queen c7 would be more about trying to get your opponent to play g3 or h3 than, we don't play chess by repeatedly making one-move threats thinking that our opponent's going to miss all of them, right? So we have to play moves which we think are going to be good even if the opponent sees our threat, most of the time. So queen c7 could be played hoping for one of these weakening moves. But queen c7 is not super powerful in this position because there is one really nice response for white, knight f3. And what's very nice about this is it not only stops bishop takes h2, but it ensures a trade of this knight for this bishop since the bishop's got nowhere to go. And that trade's going to be very, very nice for white. There's this really big open diagonal, honestly 2 open diagonals this bishop was on, right? Very, very nice. And if white can trade off that piece, white is trading off a piece that is superior. So that would be, from white's perspective, the second thing on our list down here, right? Trade a piece. This would be great for white. And if you were in this position as white, and you're like, what should I do? They're threatening to take my pawn. I could make a weakness, or make a weakness, or make no weaknesses and trade my opponent's better piece. Oh, you would get high marks for playing knight f3 as white in this position. That would be a very, very nice move. And so that move actually makes queen c7 not that great. It improves the queen, but actually it turns out it worsens this bishop by cutting off the bishop's retreat. Okay, so if you want to improve the queen, these are two logical moves that would fit the improve a piece plan with the queen. Rook e8 would be this rook to improve it is pretty simple. These pieces are all pretty well placed, so I wouldn't see any really obvious improve the piece plan for these pieces. So let's get back to the other rook. There's two ways to try to improve this rook. One is a5 to trade the pawn. Actually, three ways to try and trade the pawn and open this file. You can play b6. If you think white might trade, that's going to develop your rook. And if you don't think white's going to trade, the follow-up would be to maybe trade on c5 yourself. And then you would be creating a weakness. So this is kind of a mix, and this is just one example of how chess goes from being on some surface level maybe simple, and then immediately explodes into complexity. Because to assess the move b6, we have to think both in terms of, would this be a weakness or a strength for white we're making on c5? Are we weakening the c6 pawn, or is that okay, right? If we trade on c5, whose pieces are going to be improved? Who's getting the open file, or whose pieces are getting better? Is c5? So it's sort of, all these things tend to intersect very quickly in chess. Once people aren't just leaving, their queens hanging for you to capture. Once it gets beyond that phase and it starts being these trade-offs of different things you can do, it can quickly become very confusing who is benefited by what, trade or change. But the move b6 would be based on an idea of, I can maybe weaken this pawn on c5, or I can improve the rook. And you have to be able to assess both, and then you're saying either or to your opponent. Once you don't have to be super confident about it, but you have the idea, right? That, okay, I can either give my opponent a weakness, or I can improve my rook on a8. My opponent's going to have to choose one of those two options. Either they take or they let me take. And yeah, that would be that move, b6. As I said, a5. And finally, a move like queen d7 or queen e7 could allow this rook to come to either d8, just overprotecting d5 and radiating power through the center, or e8, which is obviously a good square for the rook, but you would have to explain if you were going for rook a to e8, what your plan was for the rook on f8, right? Why that was the best square for that rook. Because otherwise it seems like this rook has more different options between d8, a5, b6 than the rook on f8. And so you might put this rook here to be more flexible about what this rook's going to do. But anyway, from this rook's perspective, three ways to improve it, right? a5 or b6, or moving the queen out of the way, and then bringing it to one of the two central squares. Okay, so that would be improving our pieces. Then we've got the idea of building strength. So our strongest point in the pawn structure is this d5 pawn supported by a chain. This is an area where we're strong. And then we see, we've got a bunch of minor pieces here that seem to be on really great uncontested squares in the middle of the board. Man, I'm feeling pretty strong in the center. Can I build more strength in the center? One way to sort of aim towards that might be b6, trying to get rid of this pawn in order to try and play c5 at some point, but that gets into some very tricky assessments of, are we creating weaknesses for ourselves or our opponent as soon as we start challenging this pawn structure here? Because the c5 pawn would traditionally be a strong pawn if white had a pawn on d4 defending it. The fact that white traded on e5 has left this as a kind of a question. It could be strong, it could be weak, right? Can black maybe undermine it with b6 or a5? So that could be an idea. You could have an ultimate idea of getting this pawn moving after undermining the pawn blocking it. Another way to try and build center strength in this central area would be moves like rook e8, queen e7, rook d8, just bringing all the improved pieces towards that area. Let's see, we've got creating a weakness. We talked about how queen c7 doesn't truly do it. I think if you wanted to create a weakness with a threat on one of these two squares, you would actually counterintuitively start with the move bishop c7, getting out of the way of knight f3 and bishop b2 that would trade this piece. And then from here, you're looking to see that if white moves this knight towards greener pastures, it doesn't attack your bishop, and now you've got time for knight g4 or knight e4 or something like that. You can also play queen e7, so you've got queen e5 ready if the knight ever moves. But it's not a quick process, actually, to make this kind of threat over here to weaken these. So at the moment, no obvious way to poke for weakness on the king side. As I mentioned, there's b6 and a5 as ideas that might create weaknesses for white, but might also create weaknesses for black. So they're a little bit hard to assess, but definitely if you put them on the list, you know, good on you for thinking of them, and they might be very good, right? A5, you're just assessing what's weaker, b7 or a2 or c5, right? And, you know, you're thinking, what are you going to do if your opponent takes over here? Are you taking c5, a2? You know, and who is benefited by these changes in the position? Okay, so those would be some options for trying to create weakness for your opponent. It's not easy or obvious to do, and that should moderate, if we want to talk really high-level chess, that can moderate our excitement about black's visually pleasing position. It looks like black has a big advantage in central control and like really well-placed pieces, but then when you realize that your opponent doesn't have any weaknesses for you to attack yet, and that it's not obvious how to start creating weaknesses, then you want to use that to remind yourself not to get too excited about I'm crushing or I'm about to go on the attack or blah, blah, blah. It's still quite a ways away. Opening a line sounds interesting. Anytime you think you have the advantage, it could make sense to look for opening a line, but here's a really probably bad version of it. d4, trading off our strong d5 pawn for white's slightly less strong e3 pawn. I'm not a fan of d4. I would guess that it would be a slightly bad move, and that's even without calculating a complicated move like knight f3, which honestly, if you wanted to play d4, even though it's a strategic idea, you do have to double check little 1 to 2 move calculations anytime you go for pawn trades. I mean, you have to make sure, can your opponent just push past? If they take, is it defended enough times? Can you recapture? And also, yeah, this knight f3 move hitting the undefended bishop. Interesting thing about black's pieces, these are very powerfully placed in that they're attacking lots of things, but they're both undefended. So we have to be tactically careful for black with the undefended pieces. At some point, so that one we don't like, and then we mentioned a5 or b6 would be moves that would trade pawns and open a line. And that's kind of all the ideas for opening a line for the moment. Prevent the opponent. So the one thing white might like to do is take this knight on d2 and go knight f3, knight d4, hitting both bishops along the way and get there for free. Or possibly just knight f3, chase the bishop back, and then bishop b2 to take over a nice diagonal. Can we prevent the knight from coming to f3? Not really. But there are two things we can do about that idea. One is we can retreat the bishop in advance. So when the knight comes here, it doesn't come with a tempo, and that gives us freedom to respond with a move like knight e4 or bishop g4 or bishop e4, something we couldn't have played otherwise when the knight would hit our bishop. Because knight d2 was defending the e4 square, right? So if we get out of the way, then when the knight comes, we can make use of what it gives up as it improves itself. Another way to maybe try to prevent knight f3 ideas is to play knight e4 ourselves. The idea being if white trades our knight, then they can't challenge the bishop. And if they challenged the bishop, well, then we just went to this outpost very quickly, as if it were already ours and white couldn't take us. That's an interesting idea that only comes, I think, from that sort of prophylactic thinking about what's your opponent trying to do, would be to come in here. If you were just thinking about this from the perspective of trade a piece, there's nothing about this position that says black wants to trade the pieces. Like, you wouldn't go knight e4 because you're hoping to trade on d2 or something like that from a really basic perspective, because you've got a slightly stronger position in the center. And your knight is perfectly well placed, so there's no reason to think your knight is less good than your opponent's knight. In fact, it should be minutely better. Okay, so all that said, overall my guess is the position is pretty close to equal, and just being able to play a simple move like rook e8, developing the rook, or bishop c7, getting out of the way of knight f3, or queen e7, or queen d7. Those are all very, very nice, simple little moves that are going to improve your position nicely and probably maintain the position being close to equal. If you wanted to get an advantage for black in this position, you might have to look into the consequences of the much more controversial a5 move, which is sort of opening lines, maybe creating weaknesses for both players, and maybe developing this rook. That's the move that you could try to use if you think, hey, white's a little bit on the back foot, I've got a little more space, I should try to make things hard for white. That would be maybe the most interesting move to look at, although it might also not be super good. But that's where I would look. All right, let's go on to a next one. So this position here was sent to me along with the comment that it was a kind of boring game. It's white to play. And I'm not going to go step by step through everything on this things to do list because it's going to get super, super long. But looking at this position, it occurs to me that actually many of the white pieces could be improved. All right, this bishop's not really doing anything. This bishop's not really doing anything. Both rooks are on closed piles. The only pieces maybe on the best square it could be is the queen, but even there, you know, when your opponent's rook comes to the open file, you probably have to give it up. So looking at this from white's perspective, I feel like we should do a bunch of improving our pieces. If you look at weaknesses and strengths, I'm not pumped actually about all these pawn moves in front of our king. They're not really constraining the black pieces too badly. They feel a little more like weaknesses than strengths to me. So from white's perspective, I would probably want to just put a rook on the open file and try and bring the next rook there as well when I can. Bring this bishop to f1 so it controls this diagonal. And also I'd probably, when we're talking rook c1, I'd probably be pretty willing to play a move like queen c7 and trade queens. Because I think my king could be a little bit risky in the middle game. So maybe safety-wise, well, definitely safety-wise, you would want to trade pieces as white. I think overall it's a reasonable thing to do. So rook c1, rook c2, rook fc1, queen c7, queen a5, queen b3 is a possible move at any point. Getting our queen off the file so the rooks can take over, forcing black to keep this pawn defended and making way for this bishop to become better. So rook c1, queen b3 are pretty much the only moves I would consider on the first move here, right? Because I want to improve this bishop, but to do it I need to improve this rook. But to improve that I need to improve this one. So there's kind of a forced order on me there. I don't see a lot of other options for white to play here. You could play f4 thinking you're grabbing more space and building strength, but that's not aiming towards ever attacking black on the king's side. So to me, that's more of a move aimed against black playing g5 or f4 to attack us. If I thought black was threatening one of these already, I would definitely consider f4, just trying to hold the position together. But I think the open c file is important enough that if we go rook c1 and our opponent tries to attack us over here, that we should, I mean, just in general, I feel like white should be fine with the c file in this position. So I'm just, You could think of preventing it, but here I don't feel the need to. When I say the white king is weak, I mean kind of eventually, but the c file is probably important enough that if we just go rook c1, black's going to fight us over the c file. Okay, I think that was actually a slightly easier one to figure out. Only so many options. Queen b3, rook c1. That's about all I see, but let's think, what else might people have thought of? Some people might have thought of trying to trade the theoretically bad dark squared bishop, either by going to g5 or to b4. In theory, trading dark squared bishops would be probably a slightly good thing for white, so that's a great idea that you had. At the moment, it's less important to me than improving my rooks quickly, because if I trade that dark square bishop, but black gets doubled rooks on the c file, I think the c file is going to be worth more than that trade. So now it's like there's different things you want to do, and now I'm talking about what's more important than what, which is super hard. But you know, if I played queen b3 and black played queen to the c file so they can't put the rook there, well, okay, let's do this. Would I consider bishop b4 to be a decent move for white? Yeah, it should be totally fine to do that, right? That trade weakens black a little on dark squares. This bishop feels a lot worse without the dark squared bishop next to it, actually. Breaking up that bishop pair, I can feel that this guy's suddenly looking kind of dumb. Part of the reason because rooks, queens, and kings can now walk through dark squares to attack and harass him and take away squares from him that he might want to go to. So yeah, that trade looks definitely like a pleasant trade for white. So if anyone was excited about going for bishop b4, bishop g5, yeah, totally reasonable. I would say bishop g5 in general, it's going to lose a pawn. So if you really thought bishop g5 on the very first move was going to be great, you need to recalculate that and be more careful about your great idea. But if you want to go for bishop b4, yeah, it's perfectly good. Perfectly good idea. And in terms of opening lines, you know, we could play g4 and open up our king really badly and sack the pawn on h4. That's going to be a terrible idea for opening lines. There's nowhere else where we've got any way to open lines, so it's just not happening. Plus, we don't really have an advantage to press at the moment, right? So why would we be sort of opening lines as if we had an advantage? Okay, so move the queen to b3 or maybe d3. Put the rook on c1. I mean, I think queen b3 is better than d3, but for anyone who thought queen d3, that's fine too. I'll just mention more things. You know, you get your queen out of the way of the bishop and the rook. Sure. Fine move. Moving on. All right, this is this is the other one, the only two positions that people sent me with white to play. So this is white to play. And you can think about what you would consider. Try and come up with a couple ideas for white while you pause the video. And you're back. And let's get into it. So any pieces to improve for white? Yeah, maybe this bishop on e3 and rook on d3. I feel like it came to d3 with the intention of improving itself. But the open e-file might be so important that this lifting to g3 or h3 never really comes to fruition. But if I compare these bishops, this bishop looks more menacing than ours. I don't really see what we're doing over here. So I would think that maybe we'd improve this bishop by trading it for our opponent's piece that's a little bit better than ours. Downside of that is we improve the opponent's queen. So, you know, we should be cognizant. Great moves have downsides. But okay, bishop d4 is one move we could do. If you wanted to build strength, you could consider a move like h4. Just building up on this side of the board where your queen's already exerting influence and the opponent's king is there. And h4 could also prepare bishop g5 in a version that doesn't make it as easy for the opponent's queen. Right, so like h4. Well, I'm going to just on instinct play rook e8 for black, and unfortunately that's going to prevent bishop g5. I don't know if white wants to commit this much to sort of attacking ideas, but let's say that white does. And then we play, I don't know, c6 for black and bishop g5 for white. So here you can see that we're, if black takes, we're going to take with the H pawn and still take their queen off of keep their queen off F6, attack on the H file. It's going to improve our rook a lot. Meanwhile, we can leave this tension, and that's going to keep their queen from going anywhere as long as she needs to defend the bishop. So that's kind of a cool idea. A little bit unusual, but anyone who thought of that, yeah, great, creative, cool idea. H4, trying to build some strength there with the idea of bishop G5. You also have to have considered that your opponent could win this pawn. You could have discarded that on instinct, assuming you would win on the H file, or you could have calculated something to prove it. Up to you. My instinct is it works out for white, but I didn't calculate it either. Which is a good warning, since we're doing this series of videos about strategy, and chess games are almost always decided by people blundering pieces and stuff, right? We're thinking about what to do specifically in positions where we've looked at the position and there's nothing hanging, right? Otherwise, we're not talking about these strategies. If things were hanging, kings were under attack, we would just calculate, right? But the thing is, you as a chess player must always be vigilant not to fall into too much of a strategic mindset. If you sit there and all you're thinking about is, oh, I want to strengthen my position over there or create a little pawn weakness, and I can just see how I'm going to win a rook endgame against this opponent somehow because of that little weakness I created, oh my gosh, you are going to be hanging your pieces while you're thinking like that. Be very, very careful and aware that that's going to happen. Because I suggested H4, honestly, just off of pure, what to do kind of strategy stuff, and had not really taken into account that I would need to justify bishop takes H4 by delivering a checkmate on the H file. Good thing I probably could have delivered it if I needed to. All right, other things we could do. You could also play bishop D4, partly with the idea that we want to put this rook on E3, double rooks on the E file. So you could see it both as trading a piece and improving this rook. Could go for the E file. You could play bishop D4 with the view of trading the bishop and playing rook G3 to checkmate on G7. I'll just say that's not likely to work, but it's there. It's an idea. Why is it unlikely to work? I mean, anytime you trade this bishop, their queen probably comes there. Also, they're coming to the E file, and you're going to have to be defending the rook on E1 and the king on C1 pretty quickly. Like, let me show you. Okay, maybe queen takes is better because it stops queen F6, right? But even there, rook here. And are we going to play rook G3 trying to checkmate black and hanging our rook with check? Probably not, right? So we're going to trade first. But now you see the value of the file. I mean, by the time we're playing rook G3, they're playing queen E1 check. So again, we'd have to take time off to deal with that file. And now we've improved that rook a little bit, which is nice. Queen B5. And again, you want to go rook G3, but are you really ready for queen F1? I feel like we might still need to work on protecting the king. And honestly, it might be more practical to try and win the game by keeping the E file controlled than by going over to G3, right? Like, you go over to G3, all you do is create one little weakness. Then you need time for H4, H5, F4, F5 kind of moves to make something out of it. Meanwhile, your opponent will play rook E8 and kind of take over the initiative. So I think more realistically here, we're looking to play rook E7 more than rook to G3. But okay, different perspectives on what we want to do with our rooks. But in any case, we can say the move bishop D4, getting out of the way of this rook, can be seen as trying to improve the rook as well as trade the bishop. Sometimes you would say this pawn gives me a nice strong cramp. I'm powerful here. Let me set up a head duo C4, C5 with B4 to support it, right? If your king were on G1, that would be actually a good plan. I mean, I was about to say it's completely stupid, but if your king were on G1, it would be completely good. So we can see why somebody would think of it. The problem here is just when we play C4, B4, C5, we are creating a strong press from these pawns in the center, gaining space and giving ourselves options to open up a file on that side of the board when we want to. But we're opening up the king on C1 so badly that this idea is simply bad here. Your opponent can respond with perhaps C6, trade 4 pawns off in the middle of the board, and then go after your king. So it's not good here, but if you had the same position with the king on G1, which totally exists, then B4, C4, C5 would actually be a very legit plan to build strength around that d5 pawn, gain space. Get your pawns closer to queening for certain endgame scenarios. So pretty reasonable. Beyond that, we don't really have any obvious pawn breaks for opening lines or anywhere else to build strength other than what I talked about with, we could start pushing pawns here with bishop g5, or without bishop g5, you could get the queen out of the way and move a bunch of pawns on the king side. A pawn storm, that would build strength in that area, and then a later stage would be to create a weakness there and an attack over there. The first stage would be to build up some more strength. And that's position 3. Let's keep going. Good job so far, everybody. If you need to take a break, you can. You don't need to do all 5 of these exercises in one sitting. You can take a pause, go do something else, come back. But if you're going to listen to this video, please make sure to also be pausing all the time and doing the work. It's the only way to know if you've actually learned anything from the first what to do video. A lot of people watch that first kind of video, a passive video that just gives you some ideas and say, oh yeah, I learned so much, what an insight, brilliant. And then a week later, if your friend asks you, what did you learn in that video? You're like, not really sure. Vaguely there was something, but I can't articulate. So this is the video where you make sure that it's actually yours. All right, here's the position. It is black to play. Again, pause if you don't want to hear the answer yet, and if you want me to love you extra. All right, I assume you've paused. Let's get on with this. So one of the first things to note about this position, this is one of the few positions we've seen so far with the material imbalance, maybe the only one. Black's coming into this position down a pawn. They have some good things about their position, like a bunch of space, and with a lot of space, good squares available for their pieces. But you're in an endgame, so you have to squish your opponent for at least a pawn worth of compensation. Otherwise, we're talking about a bad position we're trying to defend. Okay, so what do we see here when we actually look at this? We've got a lot of strength already built, but when you've got strength built, it's very encouraging to build more strength. You may not have this experience yet, but when I see 3 pawns together, it's like, oh yeah, let me play h5, and g4, and get even stronger, right? f4. Okay, we could dream of continuing to advance. Certainly h5 improves our position. Let me say that. Once you've got this much space, you might as well try and take all of it. So we could build more strength over there. There's no pieces we want to trade, so let me just chop that off the list. Piece trades are leading towards a pawn down endgame that we would threaten to lose. And all our pieces are better than white's pieces right now, so any piece trade would also be trading a better piece for a worse piece. So really bad idea at the moment. Is there any piece we could improve? Only if we start focusing on ideas like attacking or creating specific weaknesses. So that's the part of this list that we really need to go to when we see a position like this. When you've already got great pieces, you've already built strength, you need to somehow move towards something more concrete. That is kind of the requirement. And in a sense, there's a progression of what you do in a chess game as a position develops, right? You can't start out by just attacking weaknesses when your opponent has none. We had a lot of positions up till now where I didn't talk about attacking weaknesses because there weren't really weaknesses, right? And it was like, well, first you need to make your position strong, then you need to create the weaknesses, then you need to attack the weaknesses, right? There's not many ways around that order, honestly. So here, if we judge that black's pieces are already all in great squares and that the black's built a good amount of strength, it'll be logical to start thinking about creating weakness. And so h5 g4 is one idea I put forward, with the idea that by starting to threaten to open a file or make a pawn trade on the king side, and that's obviously opening lines as well, we're asking white to think about, we're creating the possibility of weaknesses for white on the king side, and we're forcing white to make difficult decisions about which file they want open or closed and what pawn weaknesses they do or don't want. So h5 and then g4, it's even going to imply the possibility of maybe attacking the white king. Not in a way that's necessarily going to force checkmate with the number of pieces currently on the board, but in a way which could be slightly inconvenient for the king, right? So when you play h5, g4, if your opponent plays h takes g4, opening the h file where you can double, it implies that they're going to have to find a solution for the king. Either more weaknesses or, walk the king out and abandon the area. So it's a heavy choice, but when you play g4, if they don't trade on g4, then they're accepting the possibility that you could trade on h3 and give them an isolated h3 pawn and an isolated f2 pawn. And isolated pawns immediately come to mind as potential things to attack. Speaking of weaknesses to attack, there is one already in the starting position, which is the d3 pawn. And that actually kind of like shouted at me from the very moment that I first saw this position, but for whatever reason I led up to it today. It's on a semi-open file. It can't be defended by another pawn at c2 or e2. So this is what could be classified as a backward pawn in chess literature. You don't need to know or memorize terminology like that yet, but at some point when you're having a lot of fun conversations about chess with a lot of other cool chess people, it'll become useful for you if you share vocabulary. So anyway, we got this pawn. Basically what it says is we can attack it and it can't be defended by its buddies. We have pretty good control over the d4 square, so it's also hard for white to move it. So if we attack this pawn on d3, there's a fair chance we could win it. And if we don't win it, there's a fair chance we could tie white up pretty badly. Let me show you just a random sequence of moves that could be involved. King here, I move the knight out of the way to be able to defend it. I attack it, I defend it, I prepare to attack it more, defend, boom. And now, maybe we're getting into some tactics. Now, you're not calculating these tactics back here before you improve the pieces, right? But when you build up like this, now you've got the right to start looking at moves like e4 and c4 and just seeing if they're good or bad for you. It's not the purview of this video. So I'm not even going to calculate this for you, even though I see the answers and I want to. But let's just say that's one example of attacking the weakness. We didn't immediately win it, but you can see that we're starting to put pressure on it. They're a little bit tied to it. We can look at moves like e4. We could look for a knight maneuver that increases the pressure. We could look for a bishop maneuver that increases the pressure, g4, weakening our pawn structure but allowing bishop g5 to remove. See this idea of trying to remove the defender. So ideas will come up. Once you've tied your opponent down into a space where their pieces can't move because they're defending a weakness, there is a value in doing this, even if in advance you don't calculate how you're going to take advantage of it. But this is one of the things we like to do in chess, is tie our opponent down to their weaknesses so that they can't move and then do what we want with them. So that's a very, very important part of chess. And there you saw an example of it. And that's just this nice little king move, but it's really threatening that the rooks are going to use this file. Okay, so that's the weakness on d3. Another move you could consider someone might have put on their list, but I don't love it, is a5, a4. The problem is I know we're trying to open lines or create a weakness, but we're attacking white at one of their strongest points. I know it doesn't look that strong, but if you look over the whole board, b3 is one of the few pawns on the board that's defended by another pawn, and at the same time it's defended by a knight, which is white's second cheapest piece. So really, you're trying to attack white at one of their strongest points and maybe develop the rook from a1 when you trade. So I'm not pumped about the idea, but there are things going for it too. It's not a terrible idea. Just getting the pawn in touch with this when they can't take, you're trading off an isolated pawn of yours. If black's position were bad, that would be a reasonable defensive idea to try and trade off a weak pawn. If you could trade off all of your pawns, then eventually you'd probably draw the endgame down one pawn. So there is a defensive idea where if you're in an endgame and you're down a pawn, you try and trade as many pawns as you can, starting with your weak pawns. For sure, you'd want to trade these isolated pawns and keep your strong pawns at first. Pretty much the ideas I would have here for black. You could try and come up with some kind of plan to reroute and improve this knight so it attacks one of these two pawns. Or maybe f4 would actually be an ideal square for the knight. Yeah. It'd be funny if I plugged this position into a computer one day and it said the best move was knight d8. That would be hilarious. It would imply that it's of extremely high value to put this knight on f4. The knight's on a perfectly good square right now in the sense of adequate. No one would look at it and say what a bad piece. But this pawn is controlling its current hops, and from f4 it starts to Ooh, hit a bunch of things. These are all good things. 2 weak squares, a third weak square, and h3, which prevents g3 because of knight h3. Maybe you play knight d8, e6. Why would play g3 at that point to stop it? But you could call that creating a weakness. So knight d8. Gosh, I'm almost curious, like right now, if the computer would think knight d8 is the best move in this position. My instinct is that it's got to be some version of a rook on d8 and the king getting out of the way. It'd be my guess would be the best, but we don't really need to know we don't need to know which are the best ideas. We're just listing ideas, and I really don't know which one is the best. So let's keep that uncertainty. Any other ideas? The knight improvement. I don't think the bishop can really be improved here, so that's fine. So this file, yeah. And I mentioned building strength. So we're good. Let's go on to the next one. If you have any questions about an idea or a strategy that I don't mention, you can always ask in chat. I spend a lot of time trying to go back through hundreds and hundreds of comment pages to answer people's questions. Here's our final one. This one the player introduced as a badly played King's Indian defense or a bungled King's Indian defense or something of that sort. And it's true that black's pieces are tripping over the d7 square like crazy. Oops. I don't want to say too much too fast before you can pause. Are you guys quick on the pause finger? I hope so. All right, now you've been forewarned. I'm going all over this. So yes, black's pieces are tripping over the d7 square, and this knight on f8 is unfortunate. I mean, there's going to be no checkmate on h7. I guess black is ensuring that. But that's not really relevant here. Black should be striving a little bit more towards checkmating white on h2 and less towards defending themselves on h7. So definitely the black minor pieces are in a right mess and could be improved, although they're in such a mess it's hard to say how we would improve them. White has a space advantage because of the d5 pawn, and at the moment we're really feeling it as black. I mean, you could argue that every black piece is not well placed, every single one. But then you would have a hard time improving them. Now, okay, let's talk dream for black. The dream, which is not going to happen, and so we're going to reject it. The dream idea is to move this knight somewhere good, like g4, where it strikes at f2, h2, and e3, and then follow up with f5, setting up a head duo on e5 and f5, building strength towards the king side, and then creating room for the queen and bishop to follow. And knight on f8, who knows? Maybe one day. That's kind of like a dream scenario to try and play f5. The problem is if you go knight g4, white has a simple move h3, and this knight has to go back. I suppose if you were committed to this idea, we would say knight h6 is your best option, even though it makes this bishop even worse, and the knight is very bad here in perpetuity, and it actually blocks my favorite plan for black at the same time, but it at least lets us play f5. I'm concerned that if we ever play f5, our minor pieces are so badly placed, it might help white more than us. Just because normally f5 is a strong move doesn't mean it's always a strong move. If white's pieces are well enough placed and or black's pieces are badly enough placed, then when we play f5 and white plays f4, white might come out with the advantage in that kermingle. And in fact, I mean, this is a very plausible move for white to immediately play f4, not even waiting for black's f5, and say, what are you going to do? Turtle with f6, trade and give up the center. Okay, this fifth position would be easier if we were talking from white's perspective. Let's stick with black's perspective. All right, so f5 is the dream. It's hard to do. I've seen a plan of king h8, knight g8 as well to play f5. Again, those pieces are so badly placed. I'm pretty worried about it. When you've got this little bit of extra space on the queen side, or significant extra space on the queen side with the move c5, sometimes in this pawn structure that points both ways, there's a plan where you go a6 and b5 to set up a head duel on the other side of the board, build strength there, gain more space there. That's more plausible if this knight is on the queen side. If it's on a5 or c7, for example, would be two likely squares for that knight to be on, where you could go for this b5 plan. Here, if we play a6, b5, we've got no knights on that side of the board, and with the tripping over d7, no way to get knights to that side of the board anytime soon. So I am pretty convinced that a6, b5 would actually just rebound into white's favor and not black's. Okay. So far just kind of rejecting ideas. Here's an idea some people might have had. Bishop c8 to bring the knight back out to d7. Now this is probably undoing the last two moves black played. We're probably knight d7 to f8 and bishop c8 to d7. But you could argue that that's improving black's pieces a little bit and their flexibility. But I found one idea for black here that I didn't despise. So I think it's time that we come to it. The only idea I really like for black is pushing the h pawn very, very aggressively to h5. My second favorite idea is putting it on h6 and improving the knight on f8 through h7 to g5. And then the idea is we're looking at all these light squares with two knights and our bishop. And yeah, white might care. White might care a little bit. Plus the knight on f8, honestly, even if it stopped at h7, it would just be a little bit out of the way of the other pieces. Like these pieces need to get out of each other's way a little bit. So h6 would be my second favorite, to be able to play knight h7. But actually, to me, the move h5 is super clever. I know this is a very, very difficult high-level kind of example with a crazy answer and idea from me, but it's the last exercise, so why don't we have one interesting, crazy thing in here for any advanced players who are watching the video, even though they don't need to, and for anyone who just wants to get inspired by how weird and interesting and cool chess can be and how a little move on one side can impact all over the place. So let me show you my thought. One idea white might see when you play h5 is that you want to play h4 and just poke at their king position. Weaken the king a little bit because you've got some space towards the king side. Now this will be useful if they go for f4, trying to assert themselves on the king side because their king will be extra weak after h4. And it'll also be useful if they ignore you and try and play on the queen side because you'll be making progress towards eventually making threats on the king. One of the most common ways people respond to the move h5 is with the move h4 to stop the pawn dead in its tracks. But I think here that's a big mistake, and I would be positively joyful, honestly, if I played h5 and got this obvious move h4 from white stopping me, because now I want to improve my knight to this square here. And my point is that you can no longer chase me out because you don't have h3, and if you play f3, I come inside. This knight is very proud to be the only piece of blacks to make it past the second rank. It's miles and miles and miles away from the others, but it's doing great. And, okay, if white tries to defend the e3 square in preparation for f3 at some point, now I play bishop h6. I improve that bad piece, and I'm still ready to come into e3. And here I feel like I've improved a couple of my pieces. White's king side's become more brittle, right? Like less of it can move, less options. My knight can go to h7, and I could play f5, and honestly, are any black pieces tripping at this point? Do you see any black pieces tripping? I don't. Literally none of them are tripping over each other anymore once we play knight h7. And not only do we have a standard plan with f5, you also have a weird move g5, which you could play in some cases to trade pawns on the king side, looking towards a king side attack. So now I feel like, oh, it's a whole mess. I mean, white still has a lot of space and reasonably placed pieces. Maybe they've got something good to do here. But now I feel like black's actually in the game instead of suffering. This looks very sneaky strong to me. So when we play h5, another thing white could do is play h3. And now I want to go knight h7 and knight g5 again, right? Poking at this and improving the knight. And I also want to play bishop h6 to improve the bishop still. And that's why I really want to play h5. I'm playing h5. Number one, to give two new squares to these pieces. Now you could say bishop h6 could be played with the pawn here, right? But now I can't defend the bishop with this. It's kind of committed here. The knight can't follow. I don't like having this pawn blockade. I think it's a really big deal to get this square for the knight and king first, and then follow with bishop h6. So to me, h5 is a desperate grabbing of a little bit of space on the side of the board for a player very short on space, finding creative squares for their pieces to improve slightly. And it's just enough to make the game still tough for white, in my own opinion. So that, I think, is a very, very lovely little plan. We'll see if Kostya comes in the comments at some point as an experienced King's Indian player and tells me that there was a better idea for black here that I didn't notice. But that's the only thing I really like. Let's talk about a couple other things people might have mentioned. You could maybe, in a lot of positions, you would think that queen c7 or queen e7 would be improving the queen by getting out of the way of the rooks. Or queen a5. Some people might even think aggressively placed queen, doing some stuff. I just look at white's position. It's so solid. The queen's not attacking anything. And then when I look at queen c7 and queen e7, I think, yeah, but what next? The minor piece tangle is so bad. And there's no open files, so my rook position's not as important. I really feel like I need to improve the minor pieces here. That feels overriding to me. So that would be my feedback to anyone who wanted to improve the queen slightly. That queen improvement, it doesn't so much improve the queen as it gets her out of the way of the rooks. That's usually the meaning behind a little queen adjustment to one of these quarterback squares, which I love for the queen. I love her to be on the second rank in the center. My favorite. But usually it's just to get out of the way of the rooks and still be ready to go in any direction as the game develops. Here there's no open files for the rooks, so she's not really improving the rooks that much just yet. A little bit, and I'm more concerned about all these pieces. That's it. You've made it through all the exercises. Congratulations on the work that you put in. I think that you should be able to collect the fruits of your labor for a long time to come. This will give you a very solid basis for being able to come up with ideas and moves that you want to play. Anytime you're playing along in a game and there's no tactics and you just sort of run drive ideas and you're like, what should I be doing now? Right? Improve a piece. Trade a good piece of the opponent's or a bad piece of yours. Build some strength somewhere, right? Put a bunch of pawns next to each other in an area where you're good, or if you already got an area where your pawns are good, mass the pieces right behind those pawns. Create a weakness. Attack a weakness. Open up a line. You always have to open up the game eventually to win. So look where you're strong and then consider what pawn trades do you have that you can force or you could eventually force in the area where you think you're strong. And if you really love Tigran Petrosian and you want to become a super grandmaster yourself one day, you can start thinking about preventing what the opponent wants to do. What piece do they want to improve? What pawn do they want to trade? What weakness of yours are they planning to attack? And then can you stop it or get ready for it? Yeah, I said prevent, but I should have also said a lot of the time when this came up, we actually couldn't prevent it, right? It was just like, oh, well, good thing we thought of it. How are we best going to handle the situation when they get to that? All right, hope you enjoyed it. Any questions? Ask away. Have a great day, everybody.